I stood in the doorway of what used to be my childhood bedroom, staring at an empty spot on the dresser where my father's watch should have been. And for a moment, I genuinely believed I was losing my mind. The wooden box was still there, the one I had bought specifically to hold it, lined with soft gray felt, but the lid was open and the watch itself, the gold Ashford family watch that my father Walter had worn every single day of his adult life, was simply gone. My hands were shaking as I checked the drawers, the closet, even the space underneath the bed, some small, desperate part of me hoping it had simply fallen and rolled somewhere. But I already knew in my gut that this was not an accident, because nothing in that room had been touched except that one box. I am Dana Ashford. I am 44 years old, and for the last 11 years I have worked as a senior fraud investigator for one of the largest insurance companies in the state of Ohio, which meant that by the time I found that empty box, my brain had already started building a timeline before my heart even had a chance to break. My father passed away 2 years ago from congestive heart failure, and in the final 18 months of his life, I was the one who drove him to every cardiology appointment, who sat with him during long hospital stays, who eventually moved him into hospice care with my own 2 hands, helping the nurses turn him so he would not develop bed sores. So when he died, the family understood, without anyone needing to say it out loud, that his watch was mine. That watch was not just an accessory. It was a 1958 Hamilton with a worn gold case, a hand wound movement that still ticked as steadily as the day it was made, and an inscription on the inside case back that read, "To Walter, always time enough, Dad." A gift from my grandfather when my father graduated from his machinist apprenticeship, and it had been passed down with the unspoken understanding that whoever received it next would be the one who had earned the family's trust the most. My mother, Darlene, had divorced my father when I was 11 years old, a decision that at the time felt like the end of the world to me. And although the two of them eventually settled into a distant but civil relationship for my sake, I grew up primarily under my father's roof once I turned 16, which is part of why I was the one who cared for him at the end, and part of why the watch had always quietly belonged to me in everyone's mind, including, I thought, my mother's. 3 years before my father passed, my mother remarried a man named Roland Colton, a soft-spoken but emotionally rigid man who owned a small chain of auto parts stores. And Roland came into the marriage with a son from his first marriage named Preston, who was 28 years old at the time my father died, charming in the kind of way that made aunts at family gatherings laugh a little too hard at his jokes. But a young man who had never held a job for longer than 8 months, and who always seemed to be one financial crisis away from asking someone in the family for a loan he never intended to fully repay. After my father's death, I was in the middle of relocating from my old apartment into a house I had just purchased, and because the renovation was going to take almost 4 months, my mother offered to let me store some of my father's most precious belongings, including the watch, in my old childhood bedroom at her house, which still existed exactly as I had left it as a teenager, repainted but essentially untouched, and I agreed without a second thought, because at the time, despite everything, I still trusted my mother completely. I want to be clear about something before I go any further into this story, because it matters enormously to everything that happened afterward. I am not a paranoid person by nature, but my job has shaped the way my brain works. And 8 months before my father died, something had already happened in our extended family that planted a small, quiet seed of caution in me that I did not even fully register until much later. My grandmother's wedding ring, a modest but sentimental piece that had been promised to my cousin Yvette, had disappeared from my grandmother's house during a family gathering. And although nothing was ever proven, a pawn shop receipt with Preston's name on it surfaced months later when my aunt happened to be searching for an unrelated item at that same shop. And the family, wanting to keep the peace during a fragile new marriage between my mother and Roland, quietly let the matter drop after Preston tearfully claimed he had only pawned his own ring that looked similar. A story nobody quite believed, but nobody wanted to fight over either. That memory was sitting in the back of my mind on the day I brought my father's watch to Ostrowski Jewelers downtown to have it appraised and professionally serviced. Both because I wanted a formal valuation on record for my insurance policy, and because, if I am being completely honest with myself now, some quiet instinct told me to protect it beyond just locking it in a box. The jeweler, a kind older man named Emil Ostrowski, who had known my father for years because he had serviced that same watch twice before, mentioned almost casually that a growing number of his clients were having small GPS trackers, no larger than a shirt button, discreetly fitted into the empty space behind the caseback of vintage watches, specifically for insurance and security purposes, paired with a tiny voice-activated recorder that could be triggered remotely through a companion app. And I remember laughing a little and saying that seemed excessive for a family heirloom, and I remember him looking at me with a strange, knowing gentleness and saying, "Miss Ashford, I have seen more families torn apart over grandfather's watches than over houses. Sometimes the people you trust the most are the ones you need the proof against the most." I said yes. I did not tell a single member of my family that I had done this, not because I suspected any specific person of any specific crime, but because the entire point of the precaution was that it would only matter if something happened that nobody expected, and if nothing happened, no one would ever need to know, and the watch would simply sit safely in its box until my renovation was finished and I could bring it home properly. 3 weeks before I discovered it missing, my mother had hosted a big family dinner to celebrate Roland's 55th birthday. A dinner I did not attend because I was traveling for a work conference in Chicago, and looking back now, I believe that dinner was the moment everything shifted, although I would not understand the full truth of it until much later. When I finally walked into my old bedroom on that Sunday afternoon, 3 weeks after that birthday dinner, intending to grab the watch because my renovation was finally complete, and I wanted to bring my father's most precious possession into my new home, I found the box open and empty. And my mother, when I called her downstairs with a voice I barely recognized as my own, walked into that room with an expression that I can only describe now as rehearsed calm. "Mom, where is Dad's watch?" I asked, and I remember my voice cracking slightly on the word Dad, because even after 2 years, saying that word out loud still hurt in a physical way. She folded her arms and told me with a steadiness that chilled me that she had given the watch to Preston because, in her words, "Your father always had a soft spot for that boy. And honestly, Dana, you have so many of his things already, it felt right for Preston to have something too." I stood there for a moment simply trying to process the sentence, because my father had met Preston perhaps a dozen times in his life, always politely, always distantly, the way a man meets his ex-wife's stepson at holiday gatherings, and the idea that my father had any kind of soft spot for him was so absurd that for a moment I almost laughed, except nothing about my mother's face suggested she was joking. "That watch was Dad's, and it was left to me, you know that," I said, trying to keep my voice level even as my pulse pounded in my ears, and my mother tilted her head and said the words that I will never forget for the rest of my life. "You can't prove it's yours, Dana. There was never a real will, just some notes your father scribbled. And honestly, sentiment doesn't hold up in court, does it? With your fancy investigator job, you should know that better than anyone." She was smiling when she said it, not cruelly exactly, more like someone who believed she had already won an argument before it started. And in that moment I understood something important. My mother believed there was no possible way for me to prove ownership of that watch, and she was using my own profession as a taunt, as if the very thing that made me careful was somehow a joke to her. What she did not know, what none of them knew, was that 3 weeks earlier, before that watch had ever left my old bedroom, I had already turned on a discreet, professionally installed tracking device and audio recorder hidden inside its case. A small, quiet piece of insurance I had never expected to actually need. I left my mother's house that day without raising my voice again, which I know might surprise people expecting a screaming match, but 11 years of fraud investigation teaches you something valuable. The moment you show your hand in anger, you lose your advantage. So instead I simply said, "Okay, Mom," and walked out the door, got into my car, and sat in the driveway for almost 10 full minutes before I opened the tracking app on my phone with hands that would not stop trembling. The blinking dot on the map showed the watch was currently located at an address about 12 minutes from my mother's house, a modest apartment complex that I recognized immediately, because it was where Preston had been living for the past year and a half, ever since Roland had finally, after years of financial rescues, told his son he needed to figure things out on his own. I did not drive there that day, because I needed more than a location. I needed proof of intent, proof that would hold up not just emotionally, but factually, so instead I went home, sat down at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee I never actually drank, and opened the companion app's audio archive, which had been quietly recording in short automatic bursts triggered by nearby motion and sound ever since the device had been activated. What I heard over the next 2 hours changed absolutely everything I thought I understood about my own family. The first recording was from 3 weeks earlier, the night of Roland's birthday dinner, and it was my mother's voice, hushed but clear, speaking to Preston in what sounded like a hallway or a side room, saying, "I already told your father you deserve something too. It isn't fair that Dana got everything and you got nothing. Your dad feels terrible about how things have been for you financially. This could help you get back on your feet." Then I heard Preston's voice, and what he said made my stomach drop in a way I still feel when I think about it now. "Darlene, listen, I appreciate it. But I'm not gonna wear some old dead guy's watch around. I need actual cash. There's a vintage watch dealer downtown who buys stuff like this, no questions asked. It's worth at least $4,000 easy. That clears almost half of what I owe those guys." My mother's voice again, quieter now, almost pleading. "Preston, please let's not talk about the amount you owe right now. Your father cannot know how bad it's actually gotten. He already thinks I'm being too soft on you. If he finds out about the new debt on top of everything else, I don't know what he'll do. Just please, let me handle getting you the watch, and what you do with it after that is your business." I sat frozen at my kitchen table, because in a single recording, I had just learned 3 devastating things at once: that my mother had planned to steal my father's watch from me weeks in advance, that Preston had no intention of keeping it as any kind of sentimental gift, but planned to sell it to cover gambling debts, and that my mother was actively hiding the true scale of Preston's financial trouble from her own husband, which meant this was not simply a case of my mother playing favorites. This was fear, desperation, and secrecy tangled together in a way that went far deeper than I had ever imagined. The recordings continued, jumping across different days, and one from a week later captured a conversation between Preston and Roland, and this was the recording that revealed the lie at the very center of everything, because I heard Preston say to his father, in a tone dripping with false sincerity, "Dad, I'm not just taking this because I want it. Walter actually told me himself, at Thanksgiving 2 years ago, remember, he pulled me aside and said something like, 'A man needs to learn the value of time,' and he said he wished he had a son like me around more. It kind of stuck with me. So when Darlene told me she wanted me to have the watch, it actually meant something." I remember pressing my hand against my mouth when I heard that, because I was there at that Thanksgiving 2 years ago. My father had spent maybe 4 total minutes speaking to Preston that entire day, mostly comments about the weather and a passing question about how his job search was going, and the idea that my father had pulled him aside for some meaningful private conversation about time and fatherhood was not just an exaggeration. It was a complete fabrication. A lie constructed specifically to give Roland, and perhaps even Preston himself, emotional permission to take something that was never his. I heard Roland's response too, and it broke my heart in a different way, because Roland said, quiet and a little choked up, "He said that to you? Huh, that means a lot, Preston. I know things have been rough between us. I know I wasn't around enough when you were a kid. I want you to have good things in your life. You deserve that watch." Roland believed his son. He believed a fabricated memory of my dying father, because some wounded part of him desperately wanted to believe that Preston was capable of being seen and valued by another man. Any man, even one who barely knew him. And that desperate hope was exactly what Preston had learned, over years of practice, to exploit. I sat at that table until almost midnight, listening to recording after recording, piecing together a picture of a family held together by fear, guilt, and secrets. My mother terrified of losing her new marriage if Roland ever learned the true depth of Preston's addiction, Roland desperate to believe his son had changed, and that him. Self had not failed as a father, and Preston, at the very center of it, manipulating both of them with practiced ease while planning to walk into a pawn shop with my father's watch under his arm. I did not confront anyone that night. I needed to be smart about this, not just angry, so over the following 4 days I did what I do for a living. I built a case. I printed transcripts of the most important recordings. I pulled the notarized appraisal document from Ostrowski Jewelers, which listed the watch's serial number, a full photographic record, and a formal assignment letter my father's estate attorney had drafted assigning the watch specifically to me by name. A document my mother, apparently, either forgot existed or assumed I would never think to produce. I chose to confront my family not privately, but at the next scheduled family gathering, which happened to be my Aunt Yvette's 60th birthday party the following weekend. A decision some people might find harsh. But I made it deliberately, because I had learned enough in my career to know that when people are cornered privately, they often double down and destroy evidence or coordinate their stories. But when the truth is laid out in front of the people whose opinions they actually care about, in front of grandmothers and aunts and cousins, the performance becomes impossible to sustain. The party was held in my Aunt Yvette's backyard. String lights hung between the trees, the smell of barbecue smoke drifting over folding tables covered in checkered cloths, and I remember Preston laughing loudly near the drink table, my father's watch, or what I assumed was still my father's watch, nowhere visible on his wrist, which told me he had likely already begun the process of selling it. I waited until most of the family had gathered near the dessert table for the cake, and then I asked, calmly but loud enough for the immediate group to hear, "Mom, where exactly is Dad's watch right now, the one you gave Preston?" The backyard did not go completely silent. Conversations continued at the far edges, but the cluster of people closest to me, my mother, Roland, Preston, my grandmother, my Aunt Yvette, and my cousin Marisol, all turned toward me at once, and my mother's face flickered with the same rehearsed calm from before as she said, "Dana, we already talked about this. It's not really the time or place." "I actually think it's exactly the time and place," I said, pulling out my phone, "because I have something I think everyone here should hear." I played the first recording, the one from Roland's birthday dinner, my mother's voice hissing about needing to hide Preston's debts from her own husband, and I watched the color drain from Roland's face in real time, watched my mother's mouth open and close without sound coming out, watched Preston's easy, charming smile crack for just a fraction of a second before he tried to recover it. That's edited, that's not even real," Preston said quickly, and I simply pressed play on the second recording, the one where he lied about my father's supposed private conversation with him at Thanksgiving, and I watched my grandmother's face, an 83-year-old woman who had loved my father since the day he was born, harden into something I had genuinely never seen on her before. "Preston," my grandmother said, her voice trembling but sharp, "my son never had a private conversation with you at that Thanksgiving. I sat 2 seats away from both of you the entire day. You barely said 10 words to each other." Roland turned to his son, and the look on his face was not anger yet. It was something more painful to witness, a kind of dawning devastation. "Is that true? Did you lie to me about what Walter said to you?" Preston's jaw tightened, and for a moment I thought he might keep lying, might try to construct some new story on the spot. But then, almost as if the weight of everyone's eyes finally became too heavy to carry, his shoulders dropped and he said, quietly, "I owe some guys almost $9,000, Dad. I've owed it for months. I didn't know how else to get it fast without you finding out how bad it actually got. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I never should have said that about Walter." He never said anything like that to me. I needed you to say yes without asking questions. My mother had gone very pale, and she looked at me with an expression I will remember for the rest of my life, somewhere between shame and fear. Dana, I didn't know it had gotten that bad either. I mean, I knew there was debt, but not gambling, not like this. You knew enough to steal from your own daughter and lie to my face about whether I could prove ownership, I said, and my voice was shaking now, not with performance but with genuine hurt. You looked me in the eye in my own childhood bedroom and mocked me for being an investigator, like my carefulness was something to laugh at. My mother started crying then, not the calm, posed tears of someone managing a public scene, but the raw, ugly crying of someone whose careful house of justifications had just collapsed entirely in front of the people whose respect she valued most. And she said, through gasping breaths, I was scared, Dana. I was so scared that if Roland found out how bad Preston's problem really was, it would break our marriage. I've already had one marriage fall apart. I didn't want to lose another family. I thought if I could just quietly fix this one thing, nobody would ever have to know how bad it got. And I told myself the watch was just an object, that you had so many other things of your father's. I told myself it wasn't really stealing if it stayed in the family. I want to pause the story here for a moment, because this is the part where, if this were a different kind of story, I would have simply walked away from all three of them that day, cut my mother out of my life, filed some kind of legal claim over the watch, and never looked back. And honestly, in the raw heat of that backyard confrontation, some part of me wanted exactly that, wanted to protect myself by simply closing a door forever. But I did not do that, and the reason I did not do that is something I have thought about deeply in the time since. Because my father, in all his quiet machinist wisdom, used to tell me that the difference between a broken thing and a ruined thing is whether anyone is willing to do the work of repair. And looking at my mother sobbing in that backyard, looking at Roland's stricken face as he processed his son's manipulation, looking at Preston, for the first time in years. Without his charming mask fully intact, I realized that punishing all of them completely would not bring me any real peace. It would just mean I was carrying my father's absence the same way my mother had been carrying her fear, alone, and in secret, and calling it strength. That did not mean I was simply going to forgive everyone on the spot either, because forgiveness without accountability is just another kind of theft, this time of my own dignity. So instead, I told them plainly, in front of the entire gathered family, exactly what I needed to happen before any of us moved forward. I need the watch back, physically, in my hands within 24 hours, I said, looking directly at Preston. And I need to know exactly which pawn shop or dealer you were planning to sell it to, because if it has already left your possession, we are calling the police and reporting it as stolen property, full stop, no more family discussions about it. Preston, to his credit in that moment, did not argue. He simply said quietly, I haven't sold it yet. I was going to next week. It's still at my apartment. I'll bring it to you tonight. I turned to my mother next. I need you to understand that I am not doing this because I don't love you, Mom. I am doing this because I do. And because love without honesty isn't actually love, it's just fear wearing a nice outfit. She nodded, still crying, unable to speak. And to Roland, I said something I had not planned to say until the words were already leaving my mouth. Your son has a real problem, and it is not going to get better by both of you quietly managing around it. He needs actual help, real treatment, not just cash to make one debt disappear so a new one can grow in its place. That night, Preston came to my house himself, without his father, without my mother, just him standing on my porch in the dark, holding my father's watch out toward me in both hands like an offering. And he said, his voice smaller than I had ever heard it, I know sorry doesn't fix what I did. I know I lied about your dad. That's the part I feel worst about. Actually, more than the watch itself, I made up something about a man who's not even here to defend himself. And that was a horrible thing to do. I took the watch from him, checked it carefully, and found it exactly as it had always been, and I remember feeling an enormous, almost physical wave of relief that surprised me with its intensity. But I also remember looking at Preston and saying, "I don't need you to grovel on my porch, Preston. I need you to actually get help, real help. Gambling addiction is not something you fix by promising your dad you'll do better. It's a disease, and it needs to be treated like one." He nodded, and something in his face told me that, for the first time, he was actually hearing me instead of just performing contrition, and he said, "I already called a Gamblers Anonymous meeting number tonight. Before I even drove over here, I have my first meeting Thursday." I did not know yet, standing on that porch, whether any of this would actually change anything long-term, whether Preston would follow through, whether my mother's fear-driven choices would truly shift into something healthier. But I understood that the first honest moment had finally arrived, and that mattered enormously. The months that followed were not simple, and I want to be honest about that, because stories that pretend healing happens instantly do a disservice to anyone actually living through something like this. Preston attended his Gamblers Anonymous meetings consistently, and I know this not because he told me so, but because Roland, who began attending a family support group specifically designed for relatives of people with gambling addiction, told me quietly over coffee about 3 months later that he had started actually showing up to Preston's meetings, sometimes himself, sitting outside in the parking lot just to make sure his son actually walked through the door. A small act that told me Roland was finally trying to be present in the right way instead of the guilty, overcompensating way that had made him so easy for Preston to manipulate. Roland also did something I did not expect. He sat my mother down. Along with a marriage counselor they began seeing together, and told her explicitly that from that point forward, no financial decision involving Preston, including gifts, loans, or favors, would ever again be made without full transparency between the two of them. No more hiding the true scope of anything to protect the other person's feelings, and my mother told me later, with a kind of raw honesty I had not heard from her in years, that the counseling sessions had forced her to admit something she had never said out loud before, that a part of her had been trying to buy Roland's love and approval through Preston, the same way she had once tried to buy my father's patience through endless small compromises during their marriage. A pattern she said she was only now, in her 60s, finally beginning to understand and actively work to break. About 4 months after that backyard confrontation, my mother asked if she could take me to lunch, just the two of us, and over a quiet corner table at a small Italian restaurant we used to go to when I was a teenager. She slid a folded piece of paper across the table to me, and when I opened it, I found a formally notarized document, drafted by her own attorney, explicitly stating that all remaining physical items belonging to my father's estate, wherever currently located, were the sole legal property of Dana Ashford, with no future claims to be made by any other family member under any circumstances, along with a separate clause specifying that any family heirloom currently or ever again stored temporarily at her residence would require written, signed acknowledgement from both parties before any item could be moved, gifted, or transferred. "I know a piece of paper doesn't undo what I did," she said, her hands wrapped tightly around her water glass. "But I needed you to know that I'm not just saying sorry with words this time. I actually went and did something concrete about it, because I understand now that trust isn't a feeling you get to just ask for back. It's something you have to actually rebuild, brick by brick, and I am willing to do that for as long as it takes, even if it takes years." I remember sitting there holding that document, feeling something in my chest loosen slightly for the first time since I had found that empty felt-lined box, and I told her, honestly, "This helps, Mom, it really does, but I need you to know that what actually matters most to me isn't the paperwork. It's whether you can be honest with me even when honesty is uncomfortable. That day in my old bedroom, you looked me in the eye and mocked the idea that I could prove anything. That's the part that hurt worse than the watch itself." She began crying again, quietly this time, without performance, and said, "I know, and I think about that moment more than almost anything else. The way I smiled at you like I had won something. I am so ashamed of that smile, Dana. I think I smiled because some small ugly part of me was relieved that finally, for once, Preston might feel chosen the way I always worried you felt chosen by your father over me. And that is an awful, petty thing to admit. But it's the truth, and you deserve the truth. That confession, painful as it was to hear, actually meant more to me than almost anything else she could have said. Because it showed me that my mother was finally willing to look honestly at the ugly, small, human reasons behind her choices, instead of hiding behind vague justifications about family and fairness. Preston's recovery took longer, and it was not a straight line. There was a difficult month around the 6-month mark where Roland told me, with obvious pain in his voice, that Preston had briefly relapsed, placing a small bet online during a moment of stress after losing yet another job interview. But what struck me about that setback was how differently it was handled compared to before. Preston told his sponsor the same night, told his father the next morning, and voluntarily increased his meeting attendance rather than hiding the sly and letting it grow into something bigger, which is, from everything I have read about addiction recovery, actually a meaningful sign of real progress rather than failure. Around the 8-month mark, Preston asked if he could speak with me privately, and we met at a coffee shop near my office. And he told me he had picked up woodworking as a hobby, something his sponsor had suggested as a healthier outlet for the restless energy that used to send him toward the casino app on his phone. And he said, somewhat sheepishly, that he had been working on a small project he wanted to give me, though he wasn't sure if I would even want to accept anything from him. I understand if it's too soon, or if you just don't want anything from me at all, he said. I'm not trying to buy back what I did, I wanted to make something with my hands that meant something, instead of just apologizing with words again. I told him I would be willing to see it, without making any promises about how I would feel, and about 2 weeks later, he showed up at my house carrying a small, carefully finished wooden box, cherry wood, sanded smooth, with a simple brass hinge. And inside, lined with a soft dark blue felt he had chosen himself, was a space clearly designed to hold exactly one watch. I know you already have the box your dad's watch came in, he said, standing slightly awkwardly in my doorway. But I wanted to make something that was, new, something that wasn't tied to what I did, something that could maybe start a different kind of memory. I held that box for a long moment, running my thumb over the smooth wood, and I felt something shift in me, not full trust yet, that would still take time, but something like the beginning of it. A willingness to believe that people can genuinely change if they are willing to do the actual work rather than simply asking to be forgiven. Almost exactly 1 year after my father's death, on the anniversary itself, my family gathered at his gravesite, something we did every year. But that year felt different, because for the first time, my mother, Roland, and Preston all came together, standing slightly apart from the rest of us at first, unsure of their welcome. I brought the watch with me that day, worn on my own wrist for the first time since everything had happened, and after the quiet moment where we each said something to my father's headstone, Preston stepped forward, visibly nervous, and asked if he could say something out loud. And my grandmother, still fiercely protective of my father's memory, but willing, like the rest of us, to witness real change when it appeared, nodded for him to continue. Mr. Ashford, Preston said, addressing the headstone directly, his voice unsteady. I never really knew you, not the way I told everyone I did, and I am deeply sorry for using your memory to cover up my own mistakes. That was a cruel and cowardly thing to do, and I hope, somehow, you can understand that I am trying now to actually become someone worth the kind of trust I lied about having from you. Nobody said anything for a long moment, the only sound the wind moving through the cemetery trees, and then my mother reached over and took my hand, something she had not done spontaneously in longer than I could remember, and she said, quietly, just to me, "Thank you for not giving up on any of us, Dana. I know you had every right to." I looked down at my father's watch on my wrist, the same steady ticking that had marked every important moment of his life, and I thought about how close I had come to losing it forever, not just the object itself, but everything it represented, the patience my father had shown me, the quiet dignity of a man who never demanded anything but always earned everything, and I thought about how the truest tribute to that dignity was not punishing my family into silence, but holding them, all of them, to the same standard of earned trust that my father had always lived by himself. These days, almost a year and a half after that backyard confrontation, my relationship with my mother is genuinely stronger than it has been since I was a teenager. Not because the past has been erased, but because we finally built something real instead of something convenient. We speak honestly now, even when it's uncomfortable, and she has kept every single promise from that notarized document without me ever needing to remind her. Roland and Preston's relationship has changed as well into something that finally looks like real fatherhood instead of guilty overcompensation. Preston has held the same job at a local hardware store for over a year now. Steadily paying down his debts on a strict schedule, he set up himself with a financial counselor, and he still attends his meetings every week. And last month, on what would have been my father's 74th birthday, he showed up unannounced with a second small wooden box. This one for my mother, to hold a few of her own mother's old jewelry pieces safely. A small gesture that told me he had genuinely internalized something important about protecting the people around him rather than taking from them. I still keep my father's watch in the cherry wood box Preston made me, on my own nightstand, in my own home, and every morning when I put it on, I think not just about my father's steady, quiet strength, but about the strange, difficult, ultimately redemptive journey it took to bring our whole family back to something honest. Because in the end, the most valuable thing that watch ever measured was not time itself, but how long it actually takes for people to become who they claim they want to be. And I am deeply, endlessly grateful that my family, in the end, chose to do that work instead of simply asking to be forgiven.